start off this afternoon with telling you a little bit about Beethoven and where this Opus 29 quintet and how it originated, and give a little backdrop to the quintet as a genre. But first, on a more kind of personal note, it's really fun to work with these four. We met for the first time yesterday afternoon, although we've been messaging for quite some time and talking about what we're going to be doing. And I've heard great things about you, and now I've heard you in the flesh. So we had a really fun rehearsal yesterday and run through today. So thank you. It's been lovely. So just to give a little backdrop to Beethoven and how he might have come to this Opus 29 quintet. Well, we all kind of think that Mozart invented the string quintet with two violas, obviously the world's best invention. He should have just had more violas, of course. But actually it was Boccherini who first wrote quintets with two violas, and as far as I'm aware, he wrote several of them. But he also, of course, is incredibly famous for having written quintets with cellos and double basses as well. So, but he is the person who invented this beautiful, rich, creamy texture you're going to hear this afternoon. And we know the works of Mozart so much better, and they span almost 20 years of the last part of Mozart's very short life. I think his first quintet that he wrote was 1773, and he died in 1791. And in fact, the very last string quintet that he wrote, the E-flat major, K1 614, that was his very last chamber music work that he wrote before he died. And those of you who know the pieces will know that they are beyond awesome. So Beethoven had something to live up to, starting to write quintets. And actually, Beethoven's quintet, this one that you're hearing today, was completed in 1801. So if you think it's a space of only 10 years, really, between Mozart dying in 1791 and Beethoven's work that you'll hear this afternoon. And in fact, he actually wrote a quintet before this one that you're hearing, but I'll tell you that story in a moment. So I'm sure that Beethoven must have been patently aware of the wonderful quintets that Mozart wrote, and there must have been something there in his head when he put pen to paper and started to address the genre. In total, he wrote 5 quintets, Beethoven, but this is the second one, and the only one that he actually intended to be a string quintet of this combination. So what I thought I would start off with is just going through the 5 pieces, telling you what they are, when they were written, and how they kind of came about. There's some quite funny quotes from Beethoven. He's very rude, and I thought you'd enjoy listening to some of his own words. And then we're actually going to play you a little from a few of them, not just the Opus 29, because actually these works are never, ever, ever played. I've never heard the Opus 4 in E-flat major ever in a concert, and that's the first one that he wrote. So just a little about this very first quintet. Opus 4 in E-flat major, and it comes from Beethoven's very early Vienna period, so around 1795, so just 4 years after Mozart wrote his final quintet. And just as Mozart did with his second string quintet, Beethoven actually arranged this from a wind serenade of his. So it didn't start out live as a string quintet, but he made an arrangement of it. And it's the octet Opus 103 that he wrote around 1792. So actually, what's maybe a bit more advanced about Beethoven's quintet, this E-flat, is that he didn't just arrange his wind serenade, he actually made cuts, changed the music, whereas Mozart's string quintet in C minor, actually he just pretty much arranged it straight from the wind version into a string quintet version. So you're going to hear a little bit of it in a moment. We're going to play you a snippet from each of the 4 movements of the piece. And it's if you're a real chamber music fundies, which I imagine you are because you're all here this afternoon, you probably have heard Beethoven's Opus 3 string trios, and maybe you also know the Opus 5 piano and cello sonatas. And so this work is kind of sat in the middle of those as you listen to the sound world in a moment. The second piece is the one we're going to focus most of our time on today, and this is the Op.29 Quintet in C major. And as I said, it's the only work that Beethoven actually originally conceived as a string quintet, and it's certainly the greatest piece amongst the five that we have in this collection. But it's rather strangely unknown and a bit neglected, and maybe this is why. The Count Moritz von Fries, I can't really say that very nicely, but anyway, he is the person who commissioned this piece from Beethoven. And Beethoven duly wrote this piece, and he gave the autograph to the Count, and as was the custom, the dedicatee got a certain amount of time for just sole use of the piece, which the Count took willingly. I think it was around 6 months. And then Beethoven assumed that he'd get the piece back and he could then take it to be published. Well, somehow, I don't know, things got a bit lost in translation, and the Count went and took the engraved parts and the autograph off to a publisher in Vienna and got it published by Artaria without Beethoven's permission. And in the meantime, Beethoven had sold his copy to Breitkopf, and that was busy being published. So Beethoven found out about this other version. He was absolutely furious, and I think it almost ended his relationship with the Count, who he dedicated the Opus 23 and 24 violin sonatas. Later, the Seventh Symphony, he did, so they made up eventually. But it was pretty messy, and actually, Beethoven, he wrote, I just want to read you what he wrote here. So I'm just trying to look. So Beethoven, he was very critical of this publication that Artaria had made, and he published a sort of some remonstration against this work. And we think because there followed a lawsuit from this, which lasted about 5 years, that somehow in translation, this work got a bit stuck at the bottom of the pile, unfortunately. And because of that, I think it just didn't come out in the same way that many of the other pieces did at the time. And actually, it wasn't until quite a long time later, about 17 years later, that Beethoven decided actively to write another quintet. Just so you know, they thought that the autograph for the work was lost after World War II, but somehow it appeared in Krakow many years later. It apparently is in a library in Krakow where it can be viewed. And it apparently is in quite poor condition. There are a lot of leaves, so to speak, of manuscript paper, and there are an enormous number of corrections and emendations. As you can imagine, Beethoven was a perfectionist, and there are a lot of things that he redid and changed his mind about. So, to be honest, I think although Henley Urtext have done a great job to put together everything as accurately as possible, it is really likely that between the copies that the Count had, the copy that Beethoven had, and world wars and other things that have happened, that maybe we don't have the final say on this piece. And that could also explain in some way why it's been a bit sorely neglected. So maybe that gives you a context. We will also chat about a few anomalies that are in the score, and that I think maybe are interesting, that perhaps show that the autograph wasn't as clear as one would like. So that's the first two works. The third one is Opus 104 in C minor. And Beethoven wrote this in August 1807, but actually there's quite a funny story. He would never have bothered to arrange this work. It was actually originally the Opus 1 No. 3 piano trio. However, some person called Kaufmann made an arrangement of this piano trio, and Beethoven was so disgusted with it that he said, I'm going to show you how to do this a whole lot better, and he did the arrangement himself. So he wrote in his very own words, obviously translated from German. So he was so disgusted that he decided to put things to rights and made his own arrangement, elevating it from abject wretchedness to moderate respectability, he wrote. Beethoven wrote, the original three-voiced, he was horrified, quintet score of Kaufmann has been solemnly sacrificed as a burnt offering to the god of the underworld. So you can tell that he definitely did not respect that arrangement. So, I mean, there is a quintet, and it sounds really weird hearing the piano trio with a quintet, I think. But anyway, he did it out just to show someone he could do something better. So fair enough. And then the last two quintet pieces are really small. They are nothing particularly of note. The one is a fugue, opus 137, and it dates from 1817. And the fifth one is given the number Hess 40, which I'll explain in a moment. It's a quintet movement in D minor. And unlike the other quintet works, this actually never got past, like it's just a slow introduction. That's all he managed to do. And actually it was first appraised and kind of looked at by a guy called Willy Hess in 1955. So, and it was basically put into Beethoven's catalogue of works. We haven't chosen to play any of those two pieces for you. They're pretty small, but we're going to let you hear a little bit of the others in a moment. So just before we go back to the beginning again with everything, just so you sort of know the context of what else Beethoven was writing at the time of this Opus 29 quintet. So it wasn't very far off the Opus 18 string quartets, the septet, Opus 20. It was a couple of opus numbers after the Moonlight Sonata and the Pastoral Sonata that he wrote, not very far off the Spring Sonata, Opus 24. So it's so strange that this piece got lost, really. And so maybe if enough people decide to give it the light of day, it might be played a little bit more often. But what we thought we'd do is start from the very beginning, so you can hear a bit of Opus 4 in E flat, and I'll just announce the movement titles before we play our little excerpt. So thank you. So we're just playing a really short extract from the first movement. It is titled Allegro con brio. So that's just the start of the first movement. And now the second movement is an andante in 6/8. Leave you with a question. Now the minuetto is marked allegretto. It actually has two trios. So what we've decided to do is play you a small chunk of the minuet, and then the same for each of the trios, and I'll just announce them as we go along. The beginning of Trio 1. Trio 2, tacit viola 2. Now the finale, which is marked presto. So that's Opus 4. And now on to the main offering for the afternoon. And we've decided to play some quite big chunks of the first movement for you. And we're going to start off with the exposition and repeat it, because maybe the second time gives you a chance to hear some things you didn't hear the first time. And maybe some things you can think about while you're listening. Perhaps Beethoven uses very long, linear, horizontal lines, and in contrast sometimes to incredibly busy activity that's going around. He tends to use a lot of triplets for increased energy, but tries to keep everything very calm with undulating quavers and with a melody going above it. He's got some surprising little dynamics, so his usual sforzandi to keep us on our toes. And I'd say some of the key changes are a little bit unusual. He uses very quirky little bits of chromaticism to get you somewhere where you're not expecting to arrive. So, and then we'll break it down a little bit afterwards. But yeah, see what you think. We're going to play it with the repeat. Okay, so we thought we'd stop there and chat to you a little bit about, sorry, this is coming loose, chat to you a little bit about what happens in the music. And then we're going to play you the recapitulation. And I think that's when the real genius of Beethoven comes out. You hear what he does a second time when you hear the music later in the movement, different keys, totally different orchestration, and wonderful additions that make the music even more intriguing and beautiful than it already is. So I thought it might be quite interesting to play to play this playing without the slurs, because I think we forget so much as string players what our right hand and left hand do so differently. So just as by way of experiment, if we could play from the beginning until bar 16, but everything separate bows. So obviously Beethoven's effect is to have a really long, beautiful horizontal line. And maybe you can listen out the first violin and the cello are actually moving in contrary motion, and there's this lovely undulating, very peaceful, calm line going on in the first viola, and we're just kind of commenting with little crotchets. They're not particularly interesting, but they kind of give a gesture in the first phrase. And then you'll hear second viola comes in and plays the same rhythm, but an octave lower than the first viola. And I think for the effect that Beethoven's wanting, he's using making us use not much bow, so really long bows, trying to keep the phrase as legato as possible in his edition of it. But if you take away the building blocks of the bowing and you just listen to the rhythm that is there, you might just hear something else. So we're just going to play without the bowing that Beethoven wrote. So it sounds like quite different music. Now, if we go back to playing what Beethoven wrote, but what I'd like us to try is, because the violins are written in, violin and cello are written in 2-bar phrases, and actually when I join you, and at the beginning you're written in 1 bar. So maybe if you could articulate, just in a breathing way rather than a break way, between your 2 bars, and we're going to slightly articulate between our 1 bars, as if he was putting kind of more segmented breathing marks in the phrase. So he wants to hear this, but he also wants to hear this in a smaller way. Maybe also, it's very strange. Beethoven's written 3 crescendos at the end of that first phrase, and then they all finish, except bar the last one, with a sforzando piano. Maybe we can control ourselves a bit more with making each of the crescendi a little bit more, but the first one a bit less, drop back again, a bit more, and maybe save a bit more for the last one. So kind of look for 3 little points. Okay. So in a way that just, he's written it all there, but it's just up to us to try and maybe make it a little bit clearer to you what he's written, and bring that out, to the people who are listening to it. Now I would like us just to do that one more time, and I think what's quite quirky is that he puts these non-harmony notes in to just kind of fizzle things up a little bit. And actually they go to kind of weird keys. You're not expecting to move around into D and all sorts of strange keys at the beginning. Maybe we can make our chromatic notes a bit more fruity so the audience understand them. And I think there are two that we've got. Perhaps also on a kind of linear level, maybe if you're going up in the contrary motion, play a little bit more. If you're coming down, play a bit less. So if we can follow the natural line that Beethoven has written a bit more clearly. So let's go for it one last time. So audience, are you hearing anything more, a little bit more interesting now? Slightly? No? We're going to keep going. So that's basically our first subject, and then Beethoven decides to, well, that's enough being sentimental. We're going to have something a little bit more hyper now, and he immediately takes to using much more articulation to try and achieve his aim. And this time he decides to go from just quavers that you've been hearing, bada, 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 going on, to using triplets, and that immediately makes everything feel a little bit more zesty. Actually, there's sort of a real feeling of he's writing real kind of staccati in the bass lines to follow everything around. And he's got quite a few sforzandos to keep everyone on their toes, and they're not where you're expecting to find them either. They're not on a first beat, and they're not in the normal place. And he's moving around into some interesting keys. You're not expecting to be an E at this moment or A minor, but we are, and he's got us there very quickly. So it's as if it's a little bit stormy, and I think this is a kind of transition passage between the first subject and the second, which we'll get to in a moment. But maybe what we could do now, just to over-exaggerate the effect, is perhaps build on our staccati being a little bit more crisp and crunchy. Maybe our pianos can start much more quieter, so our build-ups are a little bit more volcanic. And perhaps after playing sforzandi, we can really disappear so that the surprise is a bit more shocking. So should we just go from 17? Yeah.
And where will we stop?
Oh, that's a good question. How about if we stop at like 39? Yeah.
Okay.
So a quick question. Are you all marked with staccatis after like 31 in the quavers?
I have editorial ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
So some of the problem is that some of the parts are marked with dots and some of them are not. So if we were taking what's written completely literally, maybe we could just do the literal version of what we see. And maybe we don't need to go quite so far back. Maybe we could go from 31, just dead on 31, because that's sort of where the issue is, and just play exactly what we have. Yeah, it's a bit of a conundrum because really the more accompaniment parts that are not arpeggiated there are just too heavy and cumbersome for the moving lines. So yeah, if we're trying to be better musicians, we wouldn't follow the music. But then that begs the question that we trust publishers, which we definitely shouldn't. And so then you have to bring your ears and your common sense and your grasp of style into play to definitely not do that. So my err on the side of caution, never trust a publisher. And even though, they've obviously done a very, very remarkable job putting this very tricky manuscript together, there are these anomalies. And actually at the back of the score, there are a lot of things written out saying where they had problems deciphering stuff and all sorts. So I don't know. Let's do it again with our good musician heads on. And maybe let's carry on. So we're going to carry on into the next section. And you'll hear actually it's a canon. And a one bar apart canon. I think it's the first pianissimo that we've had in the movement so far. So maybe we're going to go for something even more magical. And interestingly, Beethoven begins to write dots under slurs shortly after this canon begins. And he also writes dots over minims and then dots on crotchets. So we have quite a lot to decipher. Under a slur, are we going to play? Probably not, much more. And is a dot on a minim going to be? Probably not, because otherwise we're not playing the value of the note. But with some kind of something that separates it from the other, and obviously crotchets will be consequently a little bit shorter and maybe even lifted. So listen out for those articulations as we get a little later in the phrase. But we're going to start more or less where the canon is, so maybe from 41.
Do we need
I
to play
think
the quavers as we would?
Oh yes, that's a good idea. Yes, we're going to play our bit again, like hopefully good musicians. Good call. Bar 31 now. Thank you. Getting past where you've heard this beautiful second subject and the canon, you'll hear that suddenly Beethoven gets all bristly and restless again, and now we're swapping triplets around in groups. I wonder maybe if we could try, actually we have no articulation at all on those. It might be interesting to try it just a little bit longer and more kind of on the string, and then a super lively version. And if we maybe go from 64, I think it is, to, dead on 64. So we're going to play you exactly what we see on the music, which is with absolutely no kind of staccati. And what I hope we can do is, when we're repeating notes, not to play them too much, but when we change notes to bring it out. Mm-hmm. So if our line is going up, which all those little volcanic bits are, whenever we're changing notes, if we can play a little bit more, and if we can control ourselves until the last beat of 69 going into 70 for the crescendo, it might be even more exciting that bit later. Okay, so just from 64. we'll do the same thing with shorter articulations and still keeping the dynamic under. So I don't know, did you notice that the crescendo was a little bit more kind of vibrant a bit later there? Okay, so we'll try to still keep on controlling ourselves there, but now to play a little bit shorter. Okay. So it's amazing what Beethoven does in this exposition. And I think now maybe we will go straight to the recap and play you the other end of the drama. So the 5 actors, as we are going to have slightly different roles now. So we have to be very adaptable and become slightly different people. I'll just give you a hint. Have a listen to the second violin and the cello part. I think some very inventive and beautiful things are evident there, not only the little bird calls and chirps at the beginning of the recap, but also changes of voicing, changes of key. He uses a different material, and you can hear the coda kind of builds on everything. He gathers everything together for you at the end. So I have the feeling maybe we need to move on before we're spending a little bit too long, but I don't know, would you guys like to comment on anything in this first movement in your individual parts, or anything about the music? You don't have to, but if you would like to, you're extremely welcome. Any other observations?
I mean, it's great as a viola player having another viola player in a quartet. It doesn't happen often. So that's really nice. And the way that then changes your role in the group. Like sometimes I'm the bass to these two upper voices, and sometimes I'm the top of these two lower voices, and that's really exciting.
And actually there's points as well where he really plays around with the relationship between the cello and the viola too, because sometimes viola 2 is the bass as well, which is really, really extraordinary, and I'm doing something completely different. So yeah, he really plays with this combination a lot.
It kind of gives him gives Beethoven the freedom to do a little bit more. The cello is not always bound by the bass line, as you say. You kind of set free. And it's my job sometimes. But I think what feels lovely, in quartets, violinists always have a partner in crime. And it's nice to have a similar kind of chocolate sound next to you, and then a cello too. So I suppose it gives another dimension and line in the sound, something else to kind of listen out for. Okay, so we're on to movement 2 now. This is in F major, so the subdominant key, and it's marked Adagio molto espressivo. We're going to play you just the first subject initially. Again, when it gets to the recapitulation later in the movement, you'll be astonished by what Beethoven does. So actually, it might be quite nice to play them kind of straight after one another, so you get the full effect of the change with not me rambling in between. So you're just the music, and I think it's really beautiful what he does with the lines. So I'd say especially listen out to the cello part at the beginning, and then maybe the second violin part when we get to the recap, just for starters. so that was the opening of the movement and then the recapitulation. I think what I would like to highlight are some of the articulations that Beethoven has written and has changed. You'll notice that the cello has the walking bass pizzicato in the opening, but this amazing arpeggiated passage then is transferred into the second violin, quite different though to what the cello has. And the cello has this amazing arpeggiated, but always with rests, giving it lots of breath and life in the recap. And actually, Beethoven writes, in some passages we discovered yesterday when we were rehearsing, that he writes quite different bowing and length notes for exactly the same passage in the recap, and there's just no way that could have been a mistake. So maybe what we'll do is, could we go from the end of bar 12, perhaps just for like 4 bars, and then do exactly the same passage, I think it's the end of bar 74, just to demonstrate the change of bowing that Beethoven has written, and also a different articulation in the score. So we'll try and make it like super obvious. And to the recap, exactly the same place. So it's basically the same music, slightly different key at the end, and different use of chromaticism, but some different note lengths, change of bowing, and the music sounds really quite different if you listen really carefully. I thought it would be quite interesting just to play this wonderful moving line from bar 16, and instead of me playing the moving semis, I'm just going to hold a long note, just so that the harmonic variety there is a little bit clearer to you all. So we're just going to play maybe for 8 bars until 24. And instead of playing, this just shows you how rhythm changes the feeling of the music there. Okay. That way, you're able to hear the suspensions in the music a little bit more clearly than with the second viola doing, just highlights to you. I also, as being inside the group, it means if we can simplify things sometimes when we're playing it, we'll also be able to understand where we should bring out something that is moving in the music, and where it's not so interesting for the listener to hear the same thing thundered out too much. So showing you where something changes in the music, where the composer has done something different. Without spending too long on tiny details, I would love to play just one passage in the recap. I'm really over-classicizing the bowing just for a moment. And if you wouldn't mind going from the second half of bar 69, I think it is, 67, 68. Yeah, we could even go from the beginning of the bar, actually, maybe. What I would love to do is make the 2-note slurs really lively and articulated instead of quite calm in the adagio molto, and whenever we have a slur, to finish it quite obviously, and just to show how that changes, how we use our bows can really change the character of the music so much. Okay, so just from 69.
69.
Yeah, I think it is. Or we could go to 67. Should we do 67? That's a better place.
Oh, yeah.
So now we'll play those slurs a little bit more gently articulated, but still making you hear that Beethoven changes the harmonic and also overall rhythm of the music with his choice of bowings. They are not just bowings, but they're also shapings and phrasings. So sometimes in a slow movement like this, we wouldn't want those bowings to be too chipper and lifted and flippant sounding, but we still want you to be able to hear that something is finishing and maybe starting again, so that it doesn't become just a mush, but that there's clarity in the sound. So we're going to try and keep clarity now, but not to lose the kind of innate detail and character that Beethoven has written in for us. Shall we just do the same spot? Hopefully that was a bit more successful. The last little chunk we want to play from this movement is just a few bars from the development section. And not only because it's interesting harmonically, it gets a bit more minory and tempestuous, but he starts to use a slightly different rhythmic motive, which brings another edge of excitement to the movement. So just a little bit for you, and then we're on to the scherzo shortly. I'll leave you to go listen to the rest somewhere. Actually, we wanted to play the ending because it's so weirdly static. But maybe I thought we could try the ending two different ways. So the first time we're going to play to you is with, as if we have no, it's just completely deathly, the ending. So literally no movement. There is a fortissimo, so don't get a fright somewhere. But we're going to play to you with a really very still. And the second time, we're still going to play the dynamics that Beethoven has written, but with breath. And we're going to follow the shape of our individual lines. So if our notes are moving up, we're going to come up a little bit. If we're coming down, we're going to move down a little bit. So kind of like put a spotlight on what's happening in the music. So first up is no movement. This is quite hard to do. So I think we're going from like 111, is that right? Yeah.
that code.
Should we just go from 115 now?
Mm-hmm.
Where? Sorry.
115.
150.
You can pick your favorite one. So now on to the scherzo. It's in C. It's fun. He kind of uses the same thing over and over and over again. You're going to hear the same use of that rhythm with the same little bowing, so 2 notes slurred and 1 separate. Sometimes with a sforzando to spice it up. Sometimes we have them all together. Sometimes we're swapping them around. We're playing table tennis with them. Sometimes he's got a long pedal note underneath while some of them are playing tennis. And otherwise, there's not much else to this. The rhythm is either sometimes but all pretty much bouncy. He's written it in allegro, so it's not a presto scherzo, so I think playful. And we're just going to play it through the first section of the scherzo for you with repeats. You can see what you think. So, I don't know. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. It's fun. It's a little furious. There's a very sweet trio that follows it. But I think probably it's more fun to keep going on into the last movement, which is marked presto. You'll see why any moment now. And we thought we'd play a really big chunk for you because something rather extraordinary happens in the development section. So this movement begins with kind of crazy, sounds like lightning going off, and you don't quite know what's going to happen. And then, after the initial exposition section, Beethoven does the craziest thing. He starts a kind of fugue, but he has some of us playing in 2/4 and some of us in 6/8. And I think I shouldn't say too much to see what you think. We're going to play till just after this crazy fugue. We're going to repeat the exposition so you get a chance to watch us get really tired and play fast bows. And you can sit back and relax. We're going to try to do the pianissimos, which are very exciting at the beginning. And we're also going to try to do the fortissimos, because actually there are not that many of them. They're few and far between, but when they happen, they need to be really exhilarating and exciting. So we're going to give it our best shot. So this is the first section of the Presto. So as you can see, our bows are a mess. We've lost half our hairs on our bows. Yeah, so I don't know, it might be interesting to hear from you guys a little bit. about this beginning and your feelings about the music, and I can talk about all sorts of nonsense, but maybe you start.
Well, I think what you said about lightning is so right. It's so tempestuous. You really feel like almost the weather's involved. It's huge. I mean, really what he's asking us to do is something you hear often like in an opera pit sometimes. You know, it's really operatic, really dramatic, and not necessarily what you'd associate with string quartet of this period necessarily.
Definitely. And it turns into a violin concerto.
Yeah.
It might be interesting if we play it without the weather. So maybe if we just play the long notes. So we play our like sort of semis, but make them just like once a bar, or just change bow when we change note at the beginning. So this is, you know, how this is what actually is written, but then Beethoven decided to make it really sweaty. So
I'm still
so
playing
I
my
think
full
you
part.
yeah, unfortunately, yeah, Kate still got the hard job. But yeah, yes. But that gives you the idea. So now, as Beethoven wrote it, just to remind everybody of the weather. So, I think he, in some ways, this movement is incredibly simple in its conception, because there's this crazy scrubbing that we have to do, and then there's some quite interesting but not desperately unusual key changes. But his dramatic material, how he uses his material, is so incredibly fascinating and so brilliant. I think you'll agree that fugal section with three different lines, three different motives going on at the same time, and using the quick motive from the beginning in the first violin part all the way through it is really extraordinary. He then follows with a really twee, almost, I don't know, it seems almost out of place. It reminds me, I don't know if you know the last movement of the Opus 18 number 6 quartet, and it also has these really unusual little interjections in the middle. So you have to imagine what we play to you now is After the Storm. And we're actually just going to play this. It's marked Andante con moto e scherzoso. So it's complete change. And then it goes into a coda, which then finishes the movement. So we're gonna finish after that and let you go and enjoy what looks like there might be sunshine outside, and hope that we've tempted you enough to go and listen to this extraordinary piece of music that's been rather sorely neglected. And obviously, if you want to chat to any of us about the music afterwards, you're really welcome to do so. But we're going to finish with this Andante and then the Storm. As you'll hear right to the very end, Beethoven retains his very, very fully developed sense of humor.